It was a crisp, quiet morning when Jake Miller stood by the window, watching the soft rays of sunlight filter through the trees. His small cabin, tucked away in the woods just outside of town, had become his sanctuary. It had been months since he left the military, and even now, the air still felt heavy with the weight of his past. The memories, both vivid and haunting, lingered in the corners of his mind, threatening to pull him back into the chaos he so desperately wanted to escape. His breathing was steady, but his chest felt tight. The familiar tension in his shoulders never quite seemed to ease, and some days the silence felt like it was pressing down on him, suffocating him with its stillness. He had learned to live with the echoes of his past, but it was never easy. Beside him, a gentle nudge broke his focus. He turned to see Max, his service dog, a large German shepherd with fur as dark as midnight, standing at his side. Max's eyes were soft and understanding, and though he couldn't speak, Jake could feel the comfort radiating from him. The dog had been his constant companion since his discharge, and with every day that passed, their bond grew stronger. Max had been trained to help him with his PTSD, but Jake often felt like it was Max who was teaching him how to heal. Max nudged Jake's hand again, a subtle reminder that it was time for their morning routine. The dog was always punctual, as if he knew that the routine, the structure of the day, was what kept Jake grounded. Yeah, Jake muttered, a small smile tugging at his lips. He reached down to scratch Max behind the ears, the dog's tail wagging gently in response. "You're right, time to get moving." Max was always ready. He had been trained to help Jake with his anxiety and nightmares, to nudge him out of dark moments, and to provide comfort in ways that words couldn't. They had been through so much together, and the dog had never once failed him. Jake grabbed the leash hanging by the door and attached it to Max's collar. The small, everyday actions were simple, but they grounded him, gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. They went outside together, stepping onto the worn path that led to the nearby forest. The air smelled fresh and clean, and the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet was the only sound as they walked in silence. As they walked, Jake's mind wandered, as it often did. He thought about the years he had spent overseas, the friends he had lost, and the experiences that still felt too raw to talk about. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, and other days when he could almost forget, if only for a moment. But then there was Max, his constant presence, the quiet way the dog always seemed to know when Jake needed reassurance, was something that Jake had come to depend on. Max stopped suddenly, his ears twitching as he sniffed the air. Jake looked down at him, following the dog's gaze. There was a rustle in the bushes, and Jake felt his heart rate quicken, a familiar rush of anxiety sweeping through him. It was a reaction that had become all too common, the sudden spike of fear, even in the quiet of the woods. But then Max stepped forward, nudging Jake gently with his nose. The dog's calmness was like a tether, pulling Jake back from the edge. "Of panic. You're okay," Jake whispered, taking a deep breath as he crouched down to scratch Max's head. The dog's reassuring presence was enough to quiet the storm inside Jake, even if only for a moment. They continued their walk, and Jake felt the tightness in his chest begin to ease. Each step was a reminder that he could manage, that he could take control of the moment, no matter how overwhelming the past might be. When they returned to the cabin, Jake followed the same routine he had developed over the past few months. He fed Max, then prepared his own breakfast, carefully measured out the food for both of them. It was a simple ritual, but the predictability of it was a comfort. It gave structure to his day, something that his mind could latch onto, even when everything else seemed uncertain. After breakfast, Max lay at Jake's feet while he sipped his coffee, the silence between them easy and familiar. Jake's eyes wandered to the small bookshelf by the window, where a few worn journals sat, gathering dust. He hadn't written in them in weeks. The thought of opening them was overwhelming. Too much, too soon. Maybe tomorrow. For now, he focused. On the present, the steady breathing of Max at his side, the warmth of the sun on his face, the quiet peace of the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jake had learned that healing wasn't a quick process. It wasn't something that could be rushed or fixed with a single moment of clarity. It was the slow, steady routine of everyday life, one step at a time, that helped him begin to heal. And with Max by his side, he knew he didn't have to do it alone. The dog was more than just a companion. He was a reminder that even on the darkest days, there was still light to be found, still hope. Every day was a new chance, and with Max's steady presence, Jake was learning to trust that one day he might feel whole again. The days had fallen into a quiet rhythm. Jake and Max had settled into their routine, each day unfolding like the one before it. Early morning walks, a few hours of light chores around the cabin, and then a long stretch of quiet time in the afternoons. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. The world outside was still a bit too loud, too fast for Jake to handle, so this simple existence, free of expectations, had become his sanctuary. But not every day was peaceful. Jake knew the triggers of his PTSD by now, the sudden bursts of loud noise, the feeling of being trapped, the smell of something familiar that could unexpectedly bring memories rushing back. They were inevitable. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. This morning, it was the sound of a truck rumbling by. He heard it first in the distance, the low growl of an engine over the quiet of the woods. And then, like a switch, it was as if his body remembered, his breath quickened, his muscles tensed. He had to force his legs to move to keep walking down the trail with Max. But his mind raced, flooded with the images of the chaos he had left behind. Not today, Jake muttered to himself, trying to steady his breathing. Max's ears perked up as he trotted ahead, sensing Jake's discomfort. The dog didn't need to understand what Jake had experienced. He only needed to respond to the cues, the little signs that Jake wasn't okay. The truck passed by, but the anxiety didn't fade. Jake's heart hammered in his chest, his palms were sweating. His thoughts ran wild, and it took everything in him to keep moving, to keep his steps steady, to not let the panic take over. Max stopped abruptly, turning to face Jake, who was now several feet behind him. The dog's amber eyes locked with his, and Jake felt a surge of gratitude. Max had a way of drawing him back to the present, of gently pulling him out of the haze of anxiety. "Come on, boy," Jake said quietly, forcing his legs to move toward Max. The dog trotted back to him, nuzzling Jake's hand with his cold nose. It was a small thing, but it grounded Jake, reminding him that Max was there, a steadying force. They kept walking, though Jake's mind remained tangled in the memories. The truck's engine, the flash of gunfire, the sound of explosions, it all mingled together in a sharp, blinding moment of clarity. Jake shook his head, pushing the images away. This wasn't the time for those memories. Not here. Not now. Max stopped again, this time sitting on the trail ahead. Jake approached and sank to his knees, pressing a hand to his forehead. His breathing was shallow, ragged. He hadn't felt like this in weeks. The familiar panic, the overwhelming wave of terror was back. "Max, help," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. The dog responded immediately, standing and gently pressing his body against Jake's side, nuzzling him with the full weight of his presence. It was enough to pull Jake out of his spiraling thoughts. The dog's calm energy, the steady pressure of his body, helped him reconnect with the present. Slowly, Jake's breathing began to slow. His pulse, which had been pounding in his ears, started to return to normal. "Thanks, boy," Jake said, softly, reaching down to scratch Max's ears. The dog's tail thumped on the ground, a silent reminder that he was there, that he would always be there. After a few moments, Jake stood, feeling steadier. The trail stretched out ahead of them, the woods still and silent once more. The truck's rumble had faded into the distance, but the anxiety lingered in Jake's chest. "I don't know what's wrong with me, Max," Jake muttered, more to himself than to the dog. "I've been trying so hard to keep it together. I thought I was doing better." Max's eyes softened as Jake spoke, and though he couldn't understand the words, the dog could sense the emotions beneath them. With a soft huff, Max walked ahead, glancing back to make sure Jake was following. "Yeah, I'm coming," Jake said with a small smile. His legs felt a little stronger now. The panic had ebbed, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. "Let's finish this walk." As they continued down the trail, Jake realized that even though the anxiety would always be a part of him, it didn't mean he couldn't handle it. He'd faced the worst of it, and with Max by his side, he could find his way back, time and time again. When they finally returned to the cabin, Jake felt drained, but also strangely lighter. The morning had been difficult, but he had made it through. And with each challenge, he learned a little more about how to cope. Max, as always, had been the key. After they both had some water, Jake sat in his favorite chair by the window, letting out a long breath. The familiar sound of Max's breathing beside him was calming. For a moment, there was only the quiet of the cabin and the outside world, and Jake let himself relax. In the coming days, Jake knew there would be more moments like this, more triggers, more panic attacks, more days when the weight of his past would try to pull him under, but he also knew he didn't have to face them alone. Max was with him, always ready to help, always steady in the chaos, and that was enough. The sun was setting earlier now, the golden light filtering through the trees and casting long shadows across the cabin's front porch. Jake sat outside on the wooden steps, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in his hands. The cool autumn air bit at his skin, but it was a welcome relief after the hot summer months. There was a strange comfort in the stillness of the evening, in the way the world seemed to pause when the sun dipped below the horizon. Max lay at Jake's feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but always aware. The dog was content, but Jake could feel the stirrings of something inside him that hadn't been there in a long time. Hope. He had never expected to find it here, in this quiet cabin tucked away in the woods. But as the days passed, he started to realize that healing wasn't something that could be measured in leaps and bounds. It was in the small moments. In the mornings when Max nudged him out of bed, in the steady rhythm of their walks, and even in the evenings like this, when they simply sat together in silence. But there were still moments when the weight of the past was too heavy to ignore. "Max," Jake said, his voice low, as he stroked the dog's soft fur. The dog's ears perked up, his gaze meeting Jake's. "I've been thinking about going to town tomorrow. You okay with that?" Max's tail gave a small thump against the porch, a silent agreement. The dog didn't need to be told twice. He'd been with Jake long enough to understand the importance of routine, and if Jake needed to go out, Max was always ready. It was something Jake had been avoiding for weeks, the small errands in town, the trips to the grocery store, the brief but inevitable interactions with strangers. The thought of being around people, of facing the crowds and the noise, had always set his nerves on edge, but lately he had been feeling different. The days with Max were teaching him patience, not just with himself, but with the world around him. "I guess it's time, huh?" Jake muttered, more to himself than to the dog. Max gave a soft huff as if agreeing, and Jake smiled slightly. "All right. Tomorrow it is." The next morning came sooner than Jake had expected, and by the time the sun had fully risen, he was standing in front of the cabin, the truck parked beside him. Max sat beside the door, looking up at him with calm eyes, as if he understood what was about to happen. Jake hesitated. His fingers gripped the handle of the truck door, his stomach a tight knot. It had been so long since he had ventured into town, and the idea of facing the unfamiliarity was unnerving. The thought of the noise, the bustle of people, the sudden changes in pace, it was all too much sometimes, but Max was here, steady and patient, waiting for him to take the first step. And so Jake did. He opened the door, slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, feeling the familiar rumble beneath him. Max jumped into the passenger seat with a soft grunt, settling in comfortably. The drive to town was short, only a few miles down the dirt road and onto the main highway. Jake focused on the road ahead, keeping his hands firmly on the wheel. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe it would be harder than he thought. Maybe the anxiety would rise again, like a storm from nowhere, and he'd have to turn back. But as they neared the town, Jake realized that the world didn't feel quite as overwhelming as he had imagined. The streets were quiet this early in the morning. There were no crowds, no chaos, just a few cars parked outside the general store, a couple of people walking along the sidewalk, and Max, as always, was there, calm and steady. They parked outside the store, and Jake took a deep breath before stepping out. He reached over to gently pat Max on the head. "Stay close, all right?" Max gave a soft woof in response, already alert as Jake shut the door behind him. Inside the store, everything felt familiar, too familiar in a way. The creaky wooden floors, the scent of coffee brewing in the back, the friendly chatter between the cashier and a few of the town's regulars. It was a small town, and Jake had been here often enough before, but the people hadn't seen him in months. He wasn't sure if they'd notice the change, or if they'd remember the man who used to be in uniform, always a little too tense, a little too guarded. Jake made his way down the aisles, picking out a few essentials, canned goods, some fresh produce. His fingers hovered over the shelves as he walked, but the panic that had once overwhelmed him didn't come. Instead, there was a quiet hum in the background, the noise of normal life going on as it always had. Max was right beside him, always within a few steps, his steady presence grounding Jake. The dog's alertness was reassuring, and Jake realized that for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely out of place. He was just a man in a store, buying groceries, trying to get by. When they reached the checkout counter, the cashier, a woman named Marie, smiled warmly at them. "Well, look at you," she said, her eyes crinkling with a smile. I've seen you in a while. How's the cabin treating you, Jake?" Jake paused for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "It's been good," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "Quiet. Peaceful." "That's good," Marie said, ringing up his items. "You look, well, glad to see you out and about." Jake gave a small nod, grateful for her kindness, even if he couldn't quite bring himself to say more. She didn't press him, just bagged his items with a friendly smile, and soon they were on their way back to the truck. As they drove back, the anxiety that had once plagued Jake had disappeared, replaced by something else. A sense of accomplishment, however. Small. He had made it through the trip. He had faced the town, the noise, the people, and he had survived it. Max gave a soft grunt, as if congratulating him, and Jake couldn't help but smile. "We did it, didn't we?" Max's tail thumped against the seat, and Jake laughed softly. It wasn't a huge victory, but it was a step forward, and that, Jake knew, was the hardest part. One step at a time. The evening was peaceful when they returned to the cabin. The sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting long orange beams across the cabin's porch. The shadows grew longer, and the quiet hum of the world surrounding them was almost comforting in its stillness. It was the kind of quiet Jake had come to appreciate, but tonight there was a new feeling in the air, one that wasn't quite there before. Jake set the bags down on the kitchen table, Max already lying in his favorite spot by the window. The dog's ears perked as Jake moved around, unpacking the groceries. There was no rush, No frantic pace, just a quiet, steady rhythm to the evening that seemed to mirror the calm in Jake's chest. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt at ease in his own skin. He had faced his fear, stepped into the world again, and made it through. It wasn't easy. He had to work through the tightness in his chest, the knot in his stomach, the quiet voice in his head that always told him he wasn't enough. But he had done it. He had taken that step, and nothing catastrophic had happened. In fact, the world had gone on, just as it always had, with no judgment, no harsh words. "Not bad for a guy like me, huh, Max?" Jake said, glancing down at the dog, who gave a soft whine in response. Max's tail wagged lazily, and Jake felt a surge of warmth in his chest. It was the simple things like this, Max's presence, the quiet of the cabin, that made all the difference. After putting away the groceries, Jake settled into his favorite chair by the fireplace, his legs stretched out in front of him, Max at his feet. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Jake sighed, leaning back and closing his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to savor the peace. But even as he rested, there was a nagging feeling deep in his chest, something he couldn't quite shake. His success in town had felt good, but there was a part of him that kept wondering if it had all been a fluke. What if next time the panic was worse? What if he couldn't handle it? What if— "Stop," Jake muttered to himself. He opened his eyes and looked at Max, who was still curled up at his feet. The dog's eyes were half closed, his breathing slow and steady. He didn't need words to know what Jake was feeling. Max had always been able to sense Jake's moods, his internal struggles. Jake rubbed his face with his hand, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're right, one step at a time." The door creaked open, and Jake looked up to see the sky turning dark outside. The night was settling in, the stars beginning to emerge in the clear sky. The quiet hum of the evening surrounded them, but this time it felt like more than just silence. It felt like victory. He thought back to the trip into town. It wasn't just the fact that he had gone out, that he had faced his anxiety and come through it. It was the little things, the sense of normalcy he had found in simple acts like picking up groceries, talking to the cashier, driving through familiar streets. He had been living in a self-imposed bubble for so long, and stepping out of it, even for a brief moment, had made all the difference. Max shifted at Jake's feet, looking up at him expectantly, and Jake chuckled. "You want to go for a walk?" Max's ears perked up at the mention of his favorite word. He stood and trotted toward the door, tail wagging. Jake smiled and stood up, grabbing the leash from the hook by the door. He attached it to Max's collar, and together they stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The trail leading through the woods was quiet, just the soft crunch of fallen leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of animals in the trees. As they walked, Jake felt a sense of calm wash over him, a sense of peace he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He glanced down at Max, who walked confidently beside him, his nose twitching with every new scent in the air. "You know," Jake said, his voice softer now, "I think this is what I needed, just time and quiet." Max looked up at him as if he understood, his amber eyes shining in the moonlight. Jake's steps slowed as he took in the beauty of the woods around them, the towering trees, the soft glow of the moon filtering through the leaves. It wasn't perfect, life wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was here, and he was part of it. And for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel like he was just a bystander. He felt like he belonged. They walked for a while, the stillness of the woods wrapping around them. And when they returned to the cabin, Jake felt a strange sense of accomplishment. The world hadn't crumbled. He had faced his fear, and he had come out the other side stronger, with Max by his side, ready to face whatever came next. Jake sat down on the porch steps, and Max immediately sat beside him, leaning against his leg. The dog's head rested on Jake's knee, and Jake ran his fingers through Max's thick fur, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't do this without you," Jake murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough." Max looked up at him, his tail wagging lazily. It was enough that Jake was here, that they were together. In that moment, Jake knew that he didn't have to have all the answers. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to take it one day at a time, with Max by his side, helping him to heal, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he could breathe. The days had grown shorter, the nights longer, and Jake's routine had settled into something comfortable. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. He could wake up, tend to the cabin, take care of Max, and move through his day without the overwhelming rush of anxiety that had once been so constant. There was still a tightness in his chest at times, a lingering shadow from the past that refused to fade, but it didn't control him, not anymore. But sometimes the quiet could feel like a weight, a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on him in ways he couldn't explain. It wasn't always there, but when it came, it was like a storm cloud that loomed on the horizon, threatening to break open and drown him in its intensity. The silence of the woods, the stillness of the cabin, it could be peaceful, yes, but it could also be a reminder of the things he had buried, the things he didn't want to face. Tonight, as he sat in his chair by the fireplace, Max lying at his feet, the silence felt heavier than usual. Jake stared into the flames, the crackling of the fire the only sound breaking the quiet. Max's soft breathing filled the room, the dog's presence a comforting anchor to the world. But even that couldn't chase away the thoughts swirling in Jake's mind. It was always the same thoughts, flashes of the war, the chaos, the lives lost, the sound of gunfire, the screams, the helplessness. Sometimes it was hard to separate the past from the present, the war from the man who had returned home. The lines blurred, and in the quiet, the memories surged forward like an unstoppable tide. Max shifted at Jake's feet, nudging his hand with his nose. Jake didn't respond at first, but the dog persisted, gently pawing at him until Jake finally turned his gaze downward. "Yeah, I'm here," Jake said, his voice rough. He reached down and scratched behind Max's ears, the soft fur grounding. "Him in the present, just a lot on my mind." Max's tail thumped quietly against the floor, and Jake smiled faintly. The dog had always known when he needed a little extra reassurance, when the shadows of his past grew too close. It was as though Max could sense the weight on his chest, the silent struggle that Jake didn't always have the words for. Jake sighed and stood up, stretching his back with a grunt. The muscles there had tightened again, a reminder of how easy it was to fall into the old patterns, the ones that kept him coiled tight, always on alert. But he wasn't in the war anymore. He wasn't in that world. And yet sometimes it felt like it would never let him go. He grabbed his jacket and pulled it on, zipping it up against the cold evening air. Max stood up too, his eyes alert and focused, ready for whatever Jake needed. It was instinctual. Jake had come to rely on it. Max was always by his side, always present, always steady. "Let's go for a walk," Jake said softly, his voice a little more firm than before. Maybe moving would help. Maybe putting one foot in front of the other would be the only thing that could quiet the storm inside his head. Max wagged his tail excitedly, as if glad for the distraction. The two of them stepped outside, the cold night air hitting them as they made their way down the porch steps. Jake could feel the crispness of the air in his lungs, the way it seemed to clear his head, even if just for a moment. The woods stretched out before them, dark and silent, the trees tall and imposing against the night sky. But in the quiet, there was a sense of peace. The path was familiar now, the crunch of leaves beneath their boots, something that had become as routine as the morning sunrise. Jake's steps were slow at first, measured. But as he moved, the tightness in his chest began to loosen. The sharp edges of his thoughts, the ones that had been gnawing at him all evening, began to dull. The air was cold, but the silence wasn't so suffocating out here. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting soft shadows on the ground, and Jake allowed himself to take in the beauty around him. Max walked beside him, his head held high, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The dog was in his element out here. This was his world, and Jake had come to realize that it was slowly becoming his world too. This was where he felt most at home, in the vastness of the woods. In the calm rhythm of nature, they continued walking, the distance between the cabin and the edge of the woods growing longer. The tension in Jake's body eased as he moved, his breathing steadier with each step. It wasn't an instant fix. Healing never was, but for the first time in a long time, Jake felt the absence of the constant anxiety that had haunted him for years. It wasn't that the past was gone, or that his memories didn't still hurt, but the world around him was quieter now, more manageable. And Max was right there with him, always there. The dog's presence was like a lifeline, grounding him in the present, reminding him that there was still beauty in the world, still something worth fighting for. Eventually, they stopped at the edge of the forest, where the trees parted and the view of the cabin opened up. The lights in the windows glowed softly, a beacon in the darkness. Jake stood for a moment, taking in the sight, feeling a warmth in his chest. It wasn't just the fire inside the cabin that gave him that warmth. It was the quiet victories, the small steps forward that over time would add up to something much bigger. "Ready to head back, buddy?" Jake asked, glancing down at Max, who was sitting beside him, looking up at him with his usual calm demeanor. Max gave a soft woof in response, his tail giving a small thump against the ground. Jake smiled and turned back toward the cabin, the walk having done its job in helping him find a little more peace. As they walked back, Jake's thoughts weren't as heavy as before. The silence wasn't suffocating. It was simply the quiet of a man and his dog, walking through the woods, finding their way home. And for tonight, that was enough. The days drifted by, the rhythm of Jake's routine becoming more established with each passing week. The cabin, the woods, the endless quiet, everything had started to feel like home. It wasn't perfect, and some days were harder than others, but he was learning to live with it. He had Max, and Max had him. Together they were healing, each in their own way. That afternoon, Jake sat on the porch, watching the world around him slowly transition from autumn to the biting cold of winter. The air was crisp, the first frost of the season clinging to the edges of the ground, leaving behind a faint sheen of ice. Max was at his feet, curled up on his favorite blanket, eyes half closed in contentment. Jake's mind was quieter now. The sudden pangs of anxiety still came and went, but they were less frequent. The panic attacks had become more manageable. There was still work to be done, but he had learned that healing wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And that journey, he had learned, was about patience. Max stretched out beside him, his paw lazily swiping at the air as he dozed, and Jake smiled softly. The dog had been a constant companion, and it was through Max's quiet presence that Jake had found a peace he hadn't known he was missing. The bond between them was unspoken, built on trust and mutual understanding. It wasn't just that Max helped him. Jake was starting to realize that he was helping Max too. As a PTSD service dog, Max had been trained to respond to Jake's needs in the most intuitive ways. He knew when Jake's heart rate quickened, when his breath caught, when the walls around him started to close in. But what Jake hadn't fully understood until recently was how much he was helping Max heal as well. Max wasn't just a tool for Jake's well-being. He was a dog with his own set of scars, ones that Jake had witnessed, but couldn't yet fully comprehend. He wasn't sure if Max had suffered from his previous experiences as a working dog, but Jake couldn't help but feel that the dog had endured more than his fair share of hardship. It was on one of their walks that Jake began to see the depth of their shared bond. Max, for all his bravery and strength, had moments of hesitation. He would stop and sniff the air, his eyes darting toward the tree line as if anticipating something lurking in the shadows. There were times when he recoiled slightly at sudden sounds, the faint snap of a twig underfoot or a rustling in the brush. These were moments of vulnerability for Max, ones that Jake recognized as his own. The times when life felt unpredictable, when safety seemed too far away. Max's eyes had softened whenever he looked at Jake, as if the dog understood that Jake too had fears. That Jake was, in his own way, struggling just like him. "You know, Max," Jake said one evening as they sat on the porch, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the yard, "I think we're both learning here." Max lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting Jake's, and the dog's tail thumped softly against the porch. It was as though he was acknowledging Jake's words, even if he didn't fully understand them. But Jake didn't need Max to understand. The dog's steady gaze said everything that Jake needed to hear. They were in this together. Jake had learned to trust in the moments of silence that fell between them. There was something deeply grounding in those quiet times. The stillness where words weren't necessary, and both of them simply existed in the same space, without expectations or judgment. It was a kind of unspoken understanding, one that Jake hadn't thought possible before Max entered his life. He had been so accustomed to solitude, to keeping everyone at arm's length, that the thought of sharing his space, his pain, with another living being seemed impossible. But now, with Max, it felt natural. The truth was, Jake had never been good at asking for help. He had learned to bury his emotions, to shove them down until they were nothing more than a distant memory. But Max had cracked through that hardened shell. He didn't need Jake to say the words. He just needed Jake to be present, to take things one step at a time. And that's what they did. Together. One evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars began to twinkle above, Jake stood and stretched his legs, feeling the tightness in his back from the day's work. Max, ever the eager companion, rose. To his feet as well, his body wiggling with excitement. "Let's go for a walk," Jake said, grabbing his jacket and moving toward the door. Max barked softly and trotted to the edge of the porch, waiting for Jake to join him. Jake smiled, feeling a rush of affection for the dog. The idea of walking the same trail, the same path they had walked so many times, felt like a simple act of healing. It wasn't always about big gestures, about grand changes. Sometimes it was the small moments like these, that made all the difference. They walked through the woods, the air crisp and fresh around them. Max led the way, his nose to the ground, tail wagging as he trotted ahead. Jake followed, at his own pace, letting the familiar landscape soothe him, the crunch of the fallen leaves beneath his boots, the soft rustle of the trees swaying in the wind. It was all so peaceful, so grounding. Here, in this quiet space, Jake felt like he could breathe again. At the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin and the open meadows stretched out before them, Jake stopped. The moon was high in the sky now, casting a silvery light across the land. He felt an overwhelming sense of calm, a stillness that filled his chest and settled deep into his bones. It was a feeling of balance, of having come full circle. He wasn't whole yet, not by a long shot, but he was healing, and that, in itself, was something to be grateful for. Max turned back to look at him, his eyes shining in the moonlight. He was still, waiting for Jake to join him. They were partners, both in the process of healing, both taking the same slow steps toward peace. Jake smiled, walking up to Max and kneeling beside him. He scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling a deep sense of affection well up inside him. "You're one hell of a dog, Max. I couldn't have done this without you." Max leaned into his touch, his tail wagging gently. It was as if the dog understood the weight of Jake's words. They didn't need more than that. The simple act of being together, of walking through the world, side by side. And in that moment, with the cool night air swirling around them and the quiet expanse of the woods stretching out beneath the moonlight, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of something better. Something that didn't need to be perfect, just enough. He wasn't alone anymore, and together, with Max by his side, they would continue to heal. The weather had shifted, and winter's chill had firmly taken hold. The first snow had arrived in a gentle flurry, coating the ground with a soft white blanket that shimmered beneath. The pale light of the morning. Jake stood at the window looking out over the meadow. Max was already outside, his tail wagging as he bounded through the snow, his joy evident in every leap. Jake felt a small smile tug at his lips as he watched the dog. The sight of Max, so free and happy, always brought him a sense of calm. There was something about watching Max navigate the world with such carefree enthusiasm that made everything feel a little less heavy. Jake had been weighed down by so much for so long, the constant pressure of the past pressing in on him at every turn. But Max had an uncomplicated way of looking at the world. And sometimes Jake envied that simplicity. It was something that had taken Jake time to understand, that healing wasn't always about fixing things. It wasn't about erasing the past or even trying to forget the pain. Healing was about finding a way to live with it. It was about understanding that the scars didn't have to define you. They could be a part of you, but they didn't have to take over. And in that way, Jake had learned something from Max. The dog, too, carried his own scars, emotional and physical, but he didn't let them stop him. Max still ran, still played, still lived every moment with an open heart. There was something humbling about that. Max didn't need to understand his pain. He just needed to be there, by Jake's side, a steady presence that was unwavering and patient. After a while, Jake grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, his boots crunching in the fresh snow as he walked toward Max. The cold air bit at his cheeks, and he pulled his collar up against the wind. He found the dog near the edge of the meadow, sniffing at the ground. Max looked up when Jake approached, his tail wagging happily, and then he returned to whatever scent had caught his attention. Jake knelt down beside him, watching Max's movements. It was such a simple thing. This moment, this quiet, shared space between them, but it was everything. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, and in ways that Jake hadn't expected. He had started to understand that Max wasn't just there to help him. He was there to teach him too. "Find something good?" Jake asked, scratching behind Max's ears. The dog leaned into the touch, his body relaxed and at ease. Max barked, his tail wagging even harder, and Jake chuckled. The dog wasn't worried about the snow or the cold. He wasn't concerned with the past or the future. He was simply living in the moment, and that was enough for him. Jake sighed, feeling a pang of longing in his chest. He wanted to be more like Max in that way. He wanted to let go of the weight of everything that had happened, but it was harder for him. It always had been. There were days when he felt like the memories would swallow him whole, when the fear and the anxiety would consume him in waves. But then he would look at Max, so happy and content, and he would remember that healing didn't have to be a perfect process. It was messy and unpredictable, but that didn't mean it wasn't worth it. "Let's go for a walk," Jake said, standing up and offering Max a hand. The dog immediately bounded to his feet, his tail wagging as if he had been waiting for the invitation. They set off into the woods, the snow crunching beneath their feet as they moved forward. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar. Max walked at a steady pace beside Jake, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air, his ears perked for any signs of movement. Jake followed at his own pace, letting the peace of the forest wash over him. There was no rush here, no deadlines, no pressures, just the simple act of walking, of being in the world together. The snow continued to fall gently, covering the ground in a soft, powdery layer. Jake marveled at how the world seemed to slow down in the winter, how everything felt quieter, as if the earth itself was taking a deep breath. The forest, with its tall trees and winding paths, felt like a refuge, like a place where Jake could exist without feeling like he had to carry the weight of the past. Out here in the snow, he was just another part of the landscape, and for once, that didn't feel like a burden. They reached a clearing in the woods, the trees parting to reveal a wide expanse of untouched snow. The sunlight filtered through, the branches above casting a soft glow across the landscape. Jake stopped for a moment, taking it all in. The world seemed still, frozen in time, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace that wasn't fleeting. Max trotted. Ahead, his paws kicking up the snow as he ran in circles, his tail wagging in delight. Jake watched him, a smile tugging at his lips. Max was so carefree, so full of life, and Jake couldn't help but feel a little lighter in his presence. Maybe there was something to be said for living in the moment, for not worrying about what had come before or what would come after. Maybe, just maybe, that was the key to healing. Jake walked deeper into the clearing, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He could feel the weight of the world lifting, bit by bit with each step. He wasn't fixed, not by a long shot, but he was learning to let go, to release the grip of his past. And that, in itself, was progress. Max stopped running and trotted, pulled back toward Jake, his head held high. The dog's eyes sparkled with energy, and Jake reached down to give him a scratch behind the ears. "You know," Jake said quietly, "I think we're both getting better at this." Max barked happily, wagging his tail as if to agree, and Jake couldn't help but laugh. The dog had been his anchor, his steady presence when everything else seemed uncertain. But in that moment, standing in the middle of the snowy clearing, with Max by his side, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. It was small, tentative, but it was there, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Spring came slowly to the mountains, as it always did. The snow lingered, stubbornly in the shaded corners of the forest, but the days were growing longer. The air carried a hint of warmth, and the once frozen ground began to soften, revealing the first signs of life. The earth stirred, and so did Jake's heart. He could feel the change, even if it was subtle, like a quiet breath after a long, heavy exhale. Max had adapted well to the changing season, his coat growing thick and shiny as the days grew warmer. He still liked to run through the snow when he could find patches of it, but he also seemed to enjoy the new smells that came with spring. The scent of wet earth, of buds bursting open on the trees, of flowers beginning to bloom. Jake sat on the porch, watching the dog race through the yard, his fur glinting in the sunlight. He had been sitting outside more lately, letting the warmth of the sun soak into his skin. It felt good to let go of the heavy jacket and boots, to simply be in the moment, enjoying the simplicity of the world around him. There were no expectations here, no reminders of the past, no looming anxiety, just the present. He leaned back in the chair, allowing himself a moment of quiet. The wind stirred the trees, and the sound was soothing. Everything felt different. Now, better even. It wasn't that his past had disappeared or that his pain had vanished, but something had shifted. There was lightness where there had been heaviness, space where there had been tension. Max trotted over to Jake, his tongue hanging out, his tail wagging furiously. He dropped a stick at Jake's feet, a silent request for a game of fetch. Jake chuckled softly and reached down to pick up the stick, tossing it into the yard. Max was off like a shot, bounding through the grass in pursuit. It had become a familiar routine. Each morning, Jake would take a walk with Max, spending time in the woods. They would stop by the creek, where Max would splash in the water and Jake would simply watch. The stillness of those moments had started to feel like a form of therapy, a gentle reminder that life, even in its most uncertain moments, still offered beauty. Each step forward felt like a small victory, a reminder that Jake was reclaiming a life that not long ago had seemed impossible. One afternoon, after a particularly long walk, Jake found himself sitting beside Max on the porch, both of them tired but content. Max was curled up at Jake's feet, his breathing steady and relaxed. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, soaking in the warmth, allowing himself to simply exist. There had been so many days when it felt like nothing would ever change, when the weight of everything seemed unbearable. But those days were becoming fewer and fewer. Each step forward, no matter how small, was one more step away from the darkness he had once been trapped in. It wasn't easy. He still had bad days, moments when the anxiety would rise up, when the past would claw its way into his mind, but he had learned to manage it. Slowly, with Max's steady presence beside him, Jake had learned that healing wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about living alongside it, learning to move forward despite it. Jake opened his eyes and looked down at Max. The dog was watching him, his golden eyes bright and trusting. There was something in that gaze, something that spoke of a shared understanding, a recognition that together they had both come a long way. Max had been with him through every difficult moment, never asking for anything in return, always offering comfort without words. "I think we've both earned a rest," Jake said softly, scratching behind Max's ears. Max gave a contented sigh and closed his eyes, leaning into Jake's touch. In that moment there was no need for words. They were simply together, two beings who had found a kind of peace in each other's company. It was in these moments that Jake began to understand just how much he had changed. The pain was still there, but it no longer consumed him. It no longer defined him. He had come to terms with the fact that the healing process would never be linear. Some days it would be harder than others, but that was okay. What mattered was that he was still moving forward. He was still trying, and in that he found strength. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape, Jake stood up and stretched his legs. Max followed suit, standing and shaking the dirt from his coat. "Let's go inside, buddy," Jake said, his voice warm with affection. "I think it's time for dinner." Max gave a soft bark of agreement and trotted inside after Jake, tail wagging in anticipation of whatever meal was on the way. The cabin was quiet now, the evening settling in with the promise of rest. Jake began preparing their meal, moving with the ease of a man who had found a rhythm in his life. There were still days when the weight of the past threatened to overtake him, but he had learned how to handle those moments. He had learned that it was okay to lean on Max, to let the dog be his anchor. And in return, Jake had become Max's. They were both healing in their own ways, and that was enough. As they sat together in the warmth of the cabin, eating their dinner in companionable silence, Jake looked down at Max. The dog was content, his head resting on his paws as he chewed happily. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt a sense of peace that wasn't fleeting. It was solid, real, and that, he thought, was the true power of healing, of finding balance. Not in the absence of pain, but in the presence of peace, however. Small or quiet it might be, the spring days had stretched into early summer, and the warmth of the sun had become a constant presence in Jake's life. The steady rhythm of the seasons had begun to mirror the steady rhythm of his daily routine, and in that consistency Jake found comfort. He had settled into the life he was rebuilding, simple but fulfilling. Max was with him every step of the way, the dog's presence a constant source of stability. One of the rituals Jake had established was an early morning walk before the world fully woke up. It was a time he had carved out for himself, a time when the world was still quiet and the air was fresh with the promise of the day. He could feel the stillness around him, the sense that anything was possible, that the world was full of potential. And with Max by his side, it felt like anything was possible. On this particular morning, the sky was still a soft shade of lavender, and the sun had just begun to break over the horizon, casting long golden rays across the dew-covered grass. Max was already trotting ahead, his paws light on the ground, tail wagging in the early morning breeze. Jake followed at a steady pace, feeling the coolness of the air on his skin, the familiar tug of the leash in his hand. Max had learned to walk by his side without pulling, a testament to the trust they had built over the months. They were in sync now, their steps in harmony, the bond between them strong and unspoken. As they reached the edge of the forest, Jake paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the trees. The leaves were full and green now, the branches stretching up toward the sky in a perfect display of life's resilience. He inhaled deeply, the scent of pine and earth filling his lungs. The forest had become a sanctuary for him, a place where he could clear his mind and let go of the tension that still lingered in the corners of his thoughts. Max, as always, was a step ahead, his nose to the ground as he explored the woods, with the kind of enthusiasm only a dog could have. Jake smiled as he watched the dog, his tail held high, his body filled with energy and joy. Max's exuberance was infectious. It was hard not to smile when the dog was so full of life, so ready to embrace the world with open arms. After a few minutes of walking, Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the anxiety that still, on rare occasions, crept up on him when he least expected it. It wasn't as intense as it once was, but it was there, a quiet reminder that healing wasn't a straight line. Some days, the weight of his past still pressed against him, but then he glanced over at Max, who had stopped to sniff at a nearby tree. The dog was content, calm, and Jake could feel the shift in himself. The anxiety didn't have the same hold on him as it had in the past. He had learned to breathe through it, to let it wash over him without letting it take control. "Come on, buddy," Jake said softly, snapping himself out of the moment. "Let's keep going." Max perked up, his ears alert, and trotted ahead, leading the way as they continued deeper into the forest. The path was familiar, the trees thick with moss and leaves, the ground soft and spongy beneath their feet. There was something grounding about this walk, something that helped Jake center himself when the world felt overwhelming. They reached a clearing near the creek, where the water bubbled over rocks, clear and fast-moving. The creek had always been one of Jake's favorite places to stop, and Max seemed to feel the same way. The dog immediately darted toward the water, his paws splashing as he waded in, his mouth open in joyful anticipation. Jake stood at the edge of the creek, watching. "Max, play!" The dog was completely in the moment, chasing after sticks that Jake threw into the water, splashing with abandon, as if there were nothing else in the world. It was a simple pleasure, one that Jake could never get enough of. And in that simplicity, Jake found a deep sense of peace. He took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs, and closed his eyes for a moment. It was hard to put into words the way he felt right now. How far he had come, how much he had changed. The pain was still there, but it didn't consume him. It no longer defined his life. Instead, it was like a scar, a mark that reminded him of what he had survived but didn't control him. As Jake stood there, lost in the sound of the creek and the laughter of Max, he thought about the journey he had taken when he first came. To this cabin, he had felt so lost, empty, like he was just going through the motions. But now, things were different. There was purpose in his days. There was a sense of connection to the world around him, to the land, to Max, to himself. Max came trotting back to him, dripping wet and panting happily. The dog dropped the stick at Jake's feet, a clear invitation for another round of play. Jake couldn't help but laugh. Bending down to pick it up and throw it into the water once more, they played like that for what felt like hours. Max chasing after the stick, Jake laughing at the dog's unrelenting enthusiasm. It was a reminder that no matter what, the small moments were worth celebrating. They were the moments that made life feel full, and in those moments, Jake could see the path ahead more clearly, no longer obscured by the shadows of his past. The sun had risen higher in the sky by the time they made their way back to the cabin. The air was warmer now, the forest alive with birdsong and the rustling of leaves. Max walked beside Jake, his body relaxed, content with the morning's adventure. Jake felt lighter, as if the weight he had carried for so long had eased just a little more. As they reached the cabin, Jake paused for a moment, looking around at the home they had built together, himself and Max. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And that was enough, you know, Max, Jake said quietly, scratching behind the dog's ears. I think we've got this. Max looked up at him with those steady, golden eyes, as if in perfect understanding. Jake smiled, his heart swelling. With a quiet sense of gratitude, they had both healed in their own way, step by step, day by day. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Jake had always been a man of few words. That much hadn't changed. But there were moments now. Quiet, precious moments, when words didn't seem necessary. Healing wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was in the small things, the unspoken connections, the steady presence of Max by his side, the way the dog always seemed to know when Jake needed comfort without being asked. The days had settled into a familiar pattern. Each morning, Jake would wake early, just as the light was breaking over the mountains. Max would already be at his side, tail thumping gently against the bed, eager for their morning walk. They would venture out into the woods, sometimes along the creek, sometimes just wandering along the edge of the field, letting the stillness of the land fill them. But it wasn't just the walks. It was everything. Jake had come to appreciate the simplicity of life, the routine of taking care of Max, feeding him, brushing his coat, watching him run and play. These things mattered. They weren't just tasks. They were moments of connection, moments that tethered Jake to the present, to something larger than his own thoughts and struggles. That morning, they had spent the usual hour on their walk, then returned home to breakfast. Jake had settled into the kitchen, making coffee while Max sat by the door, waiting for the ritual of breakfast to unfold. It was all routine now, predictable, safe. But that morning something had changed. Jake had barely noticed it at first, but when he finished his coffee and stood up to clear the table, he saw Max staring at him. The dog's gaze was steady, but there was something different in it. It wasn't the usual gleam of excitement or anticipation. It was more focused, more thoughtful almost. Jake paused, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "What is it, buddy?" he asked, not expecting an answer, but Max's eyes never wavered. The dog gave a soft whine, the kind of sound that Jake knew meant something important. Something was on his mind. Jake walked over and knelt down next to Max, brushing a hand through the dog's fur. "You okay, Max?" he asked quietly. Max lowered his head, almost as though in acknowledgement. He gently nudged Jake's hand, then padded toward the door. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. Jake knew what the dog wanted. He had learned, over the months, to recognize the quiet signals that Max sent his way. There was something outside, something that needed to be checked. All right, Jake said with a chuckle, ruffling Max's ears. "You're a persistent one." Max led Jake outside, his steps purposeful. Jake followed, intrigued. The dog walked with a sense of urgency now, his nose to the ground, tail low but steady. They crossed the yard and reached the edge of the property where the woods began. Max had stopped moving when they reached the tree line. He stood still, watching, as if waiting for something. Jake squinted into the woods. The morning light hadn't fully reached this part of the forest, casting it in shadows, but there was a sound now, a faint rustling coming from deeper in the trees. Max growled low in his throat, the sound barely audible. His posture was alert, but calm. He wasn't panicked. He was simply aware. Jake's heart started to race. His instincts kicked in. Was it a wild animal? Something dangerous? He had spent enough time out here to know that the woods could be unpredictable, especially during the quiet months of spring. But he trusted Max. The dog was no stranger to danger. He had lived on the farm for years before they had come to this cabin. He knew how to protect, how to guard, how to read the signals of the wild. "Stay close, buddy," Jake murmured, moving forward cautiously. Max stayed right by his side, his eyes scanning the shadows in the woods, his ears perked. They moved slowly, the silence between them comfortable. They were a team now, an unspoken understanding between them guiding their every step. Then, as if on cue, a figure emerged from the trees, a young deer, its fur speckled with the faint spots of youth. It paused, watching them with wide eyes, and Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. There was no danger, nothing to fear, just the quiet, simple presence of nature. Max relaxed immediately, the growl fading from his chest. His tail, which had been stiff and low, began to wag gently. The deer, sensing the calmness of the situation, took a few cautious steps closer before bounding away into the forest, disappearing into the morning mist. Jake stood still for a moment, watching the deer vanish into the trees. Max sat beside him, panting lightly, his head turned toward Jake with an almost knowing expression. The dog had been ready to protect, but there was no need. It had been a moment of peace, a brief encounter with the natural world that left them both with a sense of quiet satisfaction. "Good job, buddy," Jake said softly, patting Max on the head. The dog's ears perked up at the praise, and he wagged his tail again, clearly pleased with the acknowledgement. As they walked back to the cabin, Jake reflected on what had just happened. It wasn't the first time Max had alerted him to something out of the ordinary, but it was a reminder of how far they had come together. Max had always been a protector, ever since the first day Jake had brought him home. But now, in this quiet moment, it wasn't just about protection, it was about trust. Max had sensed something that Jake hadn't noticed, and his calm presence had guided Jake through it. Together, they had shared a moment of quiet strength. It was a reminder that healing didn't always happen in grand, dramatic ways. Sometimes, it was in the small moments, when the dog sat by your side, when you trusted him to guide you through the unknown. It was in the routine, in the daily acts of care and attention, in the way the world seemed a little more manageable with a loyal companion by your side. That was the strength Jake had discovered over time, the strength of small moments. And in those moments, Jake had found the healing he had been searching for all along. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with vibrant hues of pink and orange. The evening air was cool, and the faint sounds of the world settling into nighttime filled the air. Birds had quieted their songs, and the gentle rustling of the trees created a soothing background hum. Jake sat outside on the porch of the cabin, a cup of coffee in his hands, his eyes lost in the peaceful view of the mountains. Max lay at his feet, sprawled out in a rare moment of relaxation. The dog had grown accustomed to these quiet moments, just as Jake had. They had both learned to find peace in the stillness, to embrace the simple joys of everyday life. Jake's hand stroked through the dog's fur, feeling the warmth of Max's. body the steady rise and fall of his breathing. It was hard to believe how far they had come. When they had first arrived at the cabin, both of them were shadows of their former selves. Max had been wary and distant, his trust broken by past experiences. Jake had been lost, haunted by memories that refused to let go. But in each other, they had found a quiet form of healing, a way to rebuild what had been broken. As the days passed, their connection had deepened. They no longer needed words to understand each other. The bond they shared had become something unspoken, a language of gestures and glances, of shared experiences and mutual trust. It was in the everyday moments that Jake found the most healing, the routine walks in the morning, the quiet evenings on the porch, the simple act of feeding Max and brushing his coat. These were the moments that brought him peace, that helped him find balance again. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when the weight of his past seemed to press on his chest, but Max was always there, a steady presence, reminding him that there was still beauty in the world. That night, as the stars began to twinkle, above them, Jake reflected on everything he had gained. The ache of his past was still there, but it no longer defined him. He had learned to live with it, to coexist with the parts of himself that he couldn't change. And in doing so, he had found a new sense of purpose, a purpose that didn't rely on the ghosts of war, but on the present moment, on the life he was building here with Max. "Hey, Max," Jake whispered, his voice soft in the stillness of the evening. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Max lifted his head, his ears flicking as he looked up at Jake. There was an understanding in the dog's eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had been on together. It was enough. There was no need for words beyond that quiet exchange. They had both found a new way of being together. As Jake sat there, feeling the cool breeze brush against his face, he realized that healing wasn't just about overcoming the past. It was about learning to embrace the present, to cherish the quiet moments, and to be grateful for the companions who walk beside us, whether on 2 legs or 4. Max nudged Jake's hand, seeking a final scratch behind the ears, and Jake obliged, smiling as he did so. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. They had both been through so much, but together they had learned to heal. And in that healing, they had found a new beginning. Jake took a final sip of his coffee, his heart light, his mind at ease. He and Max were no longer just surviving, they were living, and that was all that mattered. The stars above them shimmered, a quiet reminder that there was always hope, even in the darkest of nights. And with Max by his side, Jake knew that whatever the future held, he wouldn't face it alone.